Last week we looked at Elizabeth's relationship with the rest of Europe. We know that her relationship with Catholic countries weakened during the 1560s, resulting in Elizabeth's excommunication in 1570. This meant that she had been officially kicked out of the Catholic Church and that Catholics no longer had to recognise her right to rule. The excommunication led to plots against Elizabeth. Last week we looked at both the Ridolfi and the Throckmorton plots, which were both attempts to put Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. Mary was a constant threat to Elizabeth because she was a Catholic queen with right to the throne. As long as she was in England, Catholics could potentially use her to remove Elizabeth and reverse her Protestant religious settlement. Today, we're going to be looking at a third plot against Elizabeth, the Babington plot of 1586. We'll also be looking at how the plot was used to remove one of the greatest threats to Elizabeth's reign, Mary, Queen of Scots. You're going to need to write your title down in your notes. Why was the Babington plot a threat to Queen Elizabeth? We've already looked at some of the influential figures that surrounded the Queen. You should have a worksheet that looks like this in your books already. Today we're going to look at one in particular, Francis Walsingham. Walsingham was a really important figure in the discovery of these plots, as he was Queen Elizabeth's spymaster. Now, you're going to need a subtitle in your notes, as you're going to need to get down the key information about Walsingham. So who was Francis Walsingham? He was Elizabeth I's spymaster. He had a network of hundreds of spies around England and across Europe. He was a Puritan and was involved in ordering the use of torture against Catholic priests and suspected plotters. He used his network of spies and torture to uncover a range of plots against Elizabeth. But how important actually was he? Well, he had a great deal of influence at the Queen's court. He had the trust of Elizabeth and of William Cecil, her chief minister. Walsingham and Cecil worked together to introduce the Bond of Association, a document which said that anyone who attempted or succeeded to take the throne or assassinate the Queen was to be executed for treason. Now you need to pause here and make some notes on Walsingham underneath your subtitle. Let's stop for a minute and think. What do you think Walsingham thought of Mary, Queen of Scots? Well, Mary was Catholic and Walsingham was Puritan. Their religious beliefs could not have been any more opposite to each other. Mary was only in England because she had to escape Protestants in Scotland. It's not like she had a track record of positive relationships with Protestants. Even while she was seeking shelter in England, and even after Elizabeth's excommunication, Mary continued to communicate with the French, Spanish, and even with the Pope. And we know from last week that these were all countries or people that Elizabeth had increasingly worse relationships with. She had been the inspiration for rebellion in 1569, as well as actually being part of the plot. And the revolt of the Northern Earls wasn't the only plot she'd been a part of. She also plotted with Ridolfi in 1571 and Throckmorton in 1583. So, do you think Walsingham liked Mary? Absolutely not. He hated her, but with all these crimes against Elizabeth, all of which were quite serious, why was she never put on trial for her crimes against the Queen? Elizabeth lacked the evidence needed to prove Mary was guilty of anything. Mary was involved in the Northern Rebellion, the Ridolfi plot and the Throckmorton plot, but Walsingham needed to prove that she was a threat to Elizabeth with evidence to convince the Queen to execute her. Now, Walsingham is going to find this evidence through the Babington plot. So, what were the aims of the Babington plot? In order to find out, you're going to need to put yourself in the shoes of the greatest spymaster of the 16th century, Sir Francis Walsingham. You need to gather evidence against Mary, Queen of Scots. You have placed your own spy in her household, and he is able to intercept Mary's letters to Catholics across England and Europe. All you have to do is decipher them. On the next slide, there will be 3 codes. You need to see if you can crack them. Each code provides you with some details about the Babington plot. Once you've cracked the code, you then need to add the aims of the plot to the sheet that you were working on last lesson. But now we're going to fill in that last row. Okay, well done if you managed to crack the code. You now need to make sure that you've added the aims to your worksheet. Now, to find out what actually happened and to be able to fill out the next columns of the table, you need to watch this documentary clip. It's really interesting, so if you have time to watch the whole thing, do. But if not, you only need to watch the parts on the screen. In the description of this video, I've put a link to each of these times, but you will need to remember when to stop the video for yourself and skip to the next time. Okay, you need to pause and make sure that you've filled in your notes. You now need to read the textbook pages on the Babington plot. You can either use the PDF attached to this week's Google Classroom post, or you can read the exact same information on the next few slides. Just pause the video on each one. You will need to add any extra detail to your table, like who was involved and when it happened, as well as what the consequences of the plot were. Now, the biggest consequence of the Babington plot is the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. She's executed on the 8th of February 1587 at Fotheringay Castle. I always remember this date because it's actually my mum's birthday. Her trial had taken place in October 1586, during which she was found guilty of treason. Elizabeth would not sign her death warrant until the 1st of February 1587, so several months later. Even after deciding that Mary was guilty, Elizabeth was still split as to whether or not she should execute her Catholic cousin. Even after she had signed it, she refused to send it. It was agreed on the 3rd of February, during a secret meeting of the Privy Council without the Queen, that arrangements would be made for Mary's execution. When Elizabeth heard the news, she was furious and refused to speak to William Cecil for a month. The man who delivered the warrant to Mary was sent to the Tower of London for 18 months. She was so mad because a huge decision had been made without her complete consent. Even though Elizabeth knew that she had to execute Mary, the Privy Council had gone ahead and made those plans without her. This is significant because we already know that any aspect of Elizabeth's government was only ever ran with her consent. She decided who got the power, when they could meet, and what they could talk about. The fact that the Privy Council were willing to act without her consent really goes to show just how much of a threat they believed Mary Queen of Scots was to Elizabeth's. Okay, you now need to complete the last column on your worksheet on what the most threatening aspects of the Babington plot were. To help you, I've added some prompts on the screen. Mary's involvement, the role of foreign countries, and the Privy Council. We're now going to think about all three plots together. You don't need to copy any of this out, just use what's on the screen to help you think about the significance of each plot. Using the same threat levels that we've seen before, just think for a moment. How much of a threat was each plot against Elizabeth? You might want to take the following things into account. Who was involved? Was it just the English plotting against Elizabeth, or were other countries involved too? Were they involved a lot, or just a little? How organised were the plots? How does this impact how much of a serious threat they were to Elizabeth? And finally, were any of the plots partially successful? Obviously, none of them succeeded in removing Elizabeth from the throne, but were they successful at anything else? Does this make them more threatening? Once you've decided on which you think is the most threatening to Elizabeth, you need to write a conclusion in your notes that compares the threats of each of the three plots that we've looked at. On the screen, there are some sentence starters to help you structure your work. So let's recap what we've done so far. Today, we've looked at our final plot and how it led to Mary Queen of Scots' execution in 1587. Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster, had been trying to find the evidence against Mary for years, but had never before managed to prove that she'd been guilty of treason. The letters uncovered in the Babington plot finally gave him the evidence he needed to ensure her execution would finally take place. With her execution, there was now no way that Mary Queen of Scots could ever replace Elizabeth as the Queen of England. That threat had now finally been removed. In your next lesson, you're going to be analysing the execution of Mary and submitting your second assessment on this topic. And that's us done looking at the plots, so well done.